Senator Richard Black of the Virginia State Senate is here with us once again. As in the past, we really appreciate his opinions about the Syrian crisis and some international political issues that are still very relevant today. Good morning, Senator, and welcome.
Good morning. It's good to be with you, Constantino.
My first question is this. Could you remind to our followers why your position about Syria has always been so different from that held by the majority of Western politicians?
The potential for the collapse of Syria, a fall of Syria would threaten all of Western civilization. ISIS has agreed with me that if Syria falls, Lebanon would fall immediately, Jordan would fall immediately, and then there would be a great caliphate, and that would lead to an enormous pressure, military pressure on Europe, and I'm not sure that Europe has the leadership to withstand a full-out attack by Islamic terrorists. And so in this situation, Syria is the one thing that holds back this risk of Islamic terrorism flooding and destroying all of Western civilization.
Often in the past, you received very harsh criticism from members of your own party too, and ISIS has even publicly declared you as enemy. Have you ever thought that you were wrong?
I never have. I've been researching this since 2011 when we launched an unprovoked attack on Libya. And I was curious about it because I've always been involved in foreign affairs. I was a somewhat senior officer in NATO during the Cold War, and I was responsible for certain things that happened in North Africa and the Middle East. And I looked into what was going on in Libya, realized that this was an enormously unlawful attack on an independent country. Interestingly, I realized that Libya was the most prosperous North African country, the most anti-terrorist North African country, and also it was a very staunchly secular country that provided protection for minorities, including Christians, and yet we concocted a rationale for attacking and utterly destroying. You would not believe how modern Libya had become, and now it's simply left in rubble with groups of terrorists squabbling among themselves. So I thought, what are we doing? Why did we do this? Was it because of oil? And then I discovered that we were looting their very large supply of modern arms, shipping them over to Turkey and using them to topple the government in Syria. Now, what's important to realize is that Syria was the most modern of all Arab countries. They had been at peace with Israel for 40 years. They had excellent rights for women. Women could travel where they want. They could dress the way they wanted. They could marry the people they wanted. They could own property. So they were totally different than other Arab countries like Saudi Arabia, where women they had almost the same legal stature as dogs. And not in Syria. In Syria, there was equality for women. And even the government opponents admitted that in Syria they had this very unique tradition of religious harmony. Very important because there were 2 million Christians at the beginning of the war, and there were other minorities that were hated by the jihadists that we were supporting. And so I did not want to see a Christian genocide. It's important to realize that there are two sides in this war. There's the Syrian government led by President Bashar al-Assad, and there are the terrorists. Now, we called them moderate rebels, but not one group of moderate rebels, there's not one that has not fought shoulder to shoulder, side by side with Al-Qaeda or with ISIS throughout this war. So to say, oh, well, they don't call themselves this or call themselves that, I call them Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And Al-Qaeda and ISIS, which are the lead groups there, have both sworn to behead all Christians and to take their wives and their little girls and sell them as sex slaves on slave markets. And they actually set up slave markets in the ISIS-controlled areas. They didn't do it in the Al-Qaeda areas, not formal slave markets, but there was a lot of slavery going on. And when they attacked a Christian village in the government-controlled areas, Al-Qaeda would actually give their troops a list of the wives who lived there, and they would say, okay, you, Omar, you get these 5 women. If we capture this city, you get these 5 women, and these little girls, you get these little girls, and you'll own them. And so you took the most civilized of all countries, and NATO, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the rest of NATO, and then Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the Arab League, all of them were determined to put in power a puppet government that was hated by the Syrian people, despised by them. And it was like a quisling, you know, if they still use that term in Europe. Hitler put in power a man in Norway whose name was Quisling. He had no popular support. And for a while, that was the way that you would define a puppet government, would be a quisling. And so the idea was that we would put in place a quisling who would do our bidding, and in exchange, he could carry out this genocide against Christians, Alawi, Shia Muslims, Druze, and even the moderate Sunnis. And so we were complicit in this plan that, you know, we would achieve certain things we wanted, and the Saudis, with their very filthy form of Islam, it's the worst, most degraded form of Islam on earth, and they would apply that, and they would carry out a massive genocide. And so I have never been in favor of the genocide of anyone, and especially Christians, but not anyone. I wouldn't want a genocide of Sunni Muslims or anyone else. And but this is what we were willing to accept in order to topple the government and to apply our power in that area. And so we took this model Arab nation, and we decided that we would destroy it utterly and completely. And we've worked for 7 years. Now I'll tell you something. 2/3 of the world's industrial and military might have been focused on destroying one small nation that started off with a population of 23 million people. And they have fought off 2/3 of the world's industrial might. And so they're only, well, there's tremendous unity among the Syrian people. When the Syrian army just recently defeated Al-Qaeda and ISIS in al-Suwaida down in southern Syria, Al-Qaeda, or rather ISIS captured 20 Druze women and put them on display and said, if you don't carry out our demands, we're going to burn them to death. And they set off a bomb that killed 250 people in this one town. And then they attacked the town, and the people captured 3 of the ISIS soldiers. And they were so furious and had such hatred for the terrorists that we have been supporting that they went out and got rope and they strung them up and they hung them up by their necks because they hate them so much. We pretend that somehow the Syrians want us to topple the government. The Syrians, and I have tremendous contacts, a huge network of contacts, unconnected with the government. These are just ordinary people, and they consider all of the terrorists to be alike. They don't make the distinctions that the mainstream media do. And so the problem is that we have been supporting these groups of terrorists, some of them imported. We've recruited terrorists from 102 Muslim countries. We pay them, we give them arms, we train them, and we send them out to butcher ordinary women and children. And then we say, oh, well, we're bringing democracy to Syria. We're saving them from the government. Well, they love the government. They love their president. They love their first lady. And but getting back to what I said earlier, this small country has fought off 2/3 of the world's military might. And, you know, I've attended the U.S. Army War College, and I graduated from there, and we studied famous battles of the world, and there is nothing like it in history. I really do not believe that anything other than the will of God could allow Syria to survive this tremendous attack on their sovereignty. And yet they have. Now, that's my personal belief, but it's quite amazing what they have managed to achieve. They're winning the war. Many newspapers in the United States now admit openly that President Assad has won the war. Of course, there is a great deal of fighting still continuing. It would end if the United States sent a clear message that this war is going to end. We're going to cut off all supplies to rebels. And I think President Trump would like to end it, but as you know, he does not completely control our government. We have entrenched people left over from the Obama administration, very bloodthirsty people who are willing to kill and slaughter, and that's not. I don't believe that is President Trump's desire, but there are people within the bureaucracy who continue to fight against against the president on this.
Without the Russian help, Damascus would have fallen under the attacks of the jihadists. Yet the Western world did not like this intervention, although required by the legitimate Syrian government. Why, in your opinion?
Well, when Russia went into Syria, the Western powers and the Arab League had provided enormous supplies of advanced weapons to the terrorists. The terrorists were rolling back the Syrian army as valiantly as they could fight. They still were being rolled back. It's interesting that the force that Russia sent in was not a huge force. It was a modest expeditionary force. They were sent in at the invitation of the Syrian government. There were several squadrons of aircraft. There were perhaps about a battalion or two of ground forces to protect the air bases, but it was a very modest force. However, the Syrian army was enormously effective. The United States and its allies had permitted ISIS to operate a fleet of 2,000 oil tankers that carried oil that was stolen in Syria and sent it across the border into Turkey, where they were quite anxious to get it at cut rate prices. And the U.S.-led coalition never interfered at all with the oil traffic that was really the lifeblood of ISIS. The Russians went in, they took a couple of weeks to get set up, and then they said, okay, this is the pressure point, this is where we can begin to destroy ISIS. And within a period of 2 days, they went in and they destroyed 500 gasoline tankers or oil tankers that were part of this ISIS supply line. Up until then, the United States had not destroyed one. Neither the United States, the UK, France, Saudi Arabia, none of these who were part of the coalition had destroyed one single oil tanker being used by ISIS. Russia did it in 2 days. They destroyed 500, and then they continued after that. And so they were very strategic. The leadership, the Russian military leadership, was enormously effective. However, not only were they effective and smart in what they did, but they were on the side of right. They were supporting the overwhelming will of the Syrian people. The US-led coalition was trying to overwhelm the will of the Syrian people and force them to accept a puppet government, which they refused to do. Many of them understood, if we accept the US coalition's pressures and give in, if I'm a Christian, I'm going to be beheaded. My wife is going to be a sex slave. My daughters, my grandchildren, they're going to be sex slaves for these filthy, bearded, head-chopping jihadists. And so there was tremendous resistance among the Syrian people. They were not willing. Now, many of these jihadists, they were foreigners. They didn't even speak Syrian or Arabic. Some of them didn't even speak Arabic. And so they were rejected by Syria. And this is part of the reason people look, how did the Russians do this? How were they so incredibly effective with a small force when we had a mammoth force, a huge force, and they succeeded and we failed. Now, additionally, Russia was aided by having tremendous intellect in the form of Ambassador Lavrov, who is a man of supreme brilliance, and also President Putin, who is a very, very brilliant man. The two of them do world affairs like chess players, and a chess player has to say not only what can I do with this move, but what can I do with the next move and the next move and the next move. And they were excellent at this. And so being on the right side, being in support of the Syrian people, and I think, frankly, I think that the West was surprised by the quality of Russian armaments. The Russian defense establishment is light years ahead of the American defense establishment in terms of its effectiveness and its cost containment, its efficiency. The U.S. has by far the world's largest military industrial complex, but it's very bloated, it's very inefficient, and so I think it surprised us that Russia, with a far smaller gross domestic product, was able to produce weapons which were highly competitive and highly effective. And so that was very helpful to Syria. And so the Russian intervention was crucial. And the irony of this is that while the leaders of the major Western powers disliked Russia's involvement, Russia has literally saved Western civilization. Russia, combined with, of course, the tremendous sacrifice of the Syrian people, and also with the aid of Iran. We should be grateful. Germany, France, Great Britain, even the United States should be enormously grateful that Russia went in when it did, because while they had their own interests that they were focused on, the collateral effect was that they literally have saved Western civilization to survive and fight on another day.
In your opinion, who are the jihadist sponsors in Syria?
Excuse me.
In your opinion, who are the jihadist sponsors in Syria? The sponsors of the jihadists?
It's very clear that the primary ones are the United States, the United Kingdom, and France. Israel has helped the jihadists. NATO in general has been supportive. Now, they haven't been unified in their support, but they back up the U.S. sanctions on Syria, which are designed to create starvation, hardship, suffering among the ordinary people of Syria. And that required the backing of all of the NATO countries. And so, but the big three, the U.S., the United Kingdom, and France. Now, that's on the Western side. On the Arabic side, the number one terror sponsor within all of the world is Saudi Arabia. Sometimes it's said that it's Iran. I find no evidence to support that whatsoever, other than thousands of people repeating a slogan. The sponsor of terror around the world is Saudi Arabia. Qatar has also sponsored terrorism, especially within Syria. And then Turkey. Turkey was really the only significant trading partner for ISIS. And when ISIS was a great caliphate, covering a huge span, almost all of its trade was done with Turkey, with the clear understanding of President Erdogan and the Syrian military. And so these were the sponsors of the terrorists. It's interesting. The Arab Spring originated supposedly in Tunisia, when there was a man who was mistreated and he burned himself to death. People commit suicide all over the world, and it doesn't create an Arab Spring and an uprising everywhere. There have to be a whole lot of people who work, a lot of intelligence agencies to make that burst into flames. Ironically, this Tunisia, where it all started, supplied more fighters to ISIS than any other single country, which tells you something about the Arab Spring and democracy, that Tunisia turned out to be the #1 supplier of ISIS combatants.
Do you think that sooner or later there will be dangerous tensions between Russia and Israel regarding Syria, or once again between Russia and Turkey?
The Israelis provided medical attention for Al-Qaeda and ISIS along their border. The last pocket of ISIS in southern Syria was up against the Israeli and Jordanian borders. So there was no pressure on them from the Israelis or from the Jordanians. All of the pressure against ISIS in the south has come from the Syrian government. There were considerable tensions, and there still are tensions. Israel, throughout the war, has periodically bombed various sites within Syria. And however, as of today, ISIS is defeated in the south. Al-Qaeda is defeated in the south. The Syrian army now controls the border right up to the occupied Golan Heights and up to the Jordanian border. And I think that's going to relieve a lot of the tension. And there have been a lot of discussions between President Putin and Netanyahu. And I think they have managed to diminish tensions. Now, Israel still demands on having Iran remove all of its troops from Syria. However, the Iranians have probably had 8,000 people killed during the course of the war in Syria. They have invested blood and treasure. The reason for, people don't understand why Iran is in Syria. They think it's because they want to be hostile towards someone. The reason that they're in Syria is that they look at Syria as being a buffer state against any attack on Iran. They want Syria to be a strong, independent state. They want Iraq to be a strong independent state, because any army that comes into Iran has to go through Syria and through Iraq, and so certainly they view that as sort of one of their lines of defense against aggression. I don't think that Iran certainly does not control Syria. They're allies, but they don't control. The Syrian people are different than the Persians. They have linguistic differences. They have cultural differences. So they're no threat to anyone. But I don't think that they will leave, because if they leave, it'll be a sort of a void in the alliance that keeps Syria together. Even though it's a small slice of the pie, it's a critical one, and they've been very helpful. So, but I don't think that any tensions there will get out of control. With Turkey, it's more complex. I think Russia is an excellent intermediary, hopefully to help get the Americans to withdraw, because the Americans now occupy about a quarter of all of Syria, and we use a Kurdish proxy army to do it, but really all of the orders come from the United States, and all of the strategy is from the United States. The Kurds are beginning to understand that, and as we speak right now, there is a Kurdish delegation meeting with the national government in Damascus, Syria, to talk about normalizing and sort of reinstituting the Kurds into the Syrian government. So Turkey is very worried about the Kurds. They do not want to have a Kurdish state on their border, which has always been one of the fallacies in the American plan to split off part of Syria and give it to the Kurds. Clearly that's impossible, because you'd have a landlocked country surrounded by enemies. They couldn't even fly planes in and out, because they have to go over airspace of Turkey, Iraq, or Syria, and none of them are going to allow aircraft unless they're U.S. military aircraft. So it's very impractical for the Kurds to take off that part of northern Syria and make it a Kurdish state. Not only that, but they're a minority. The Arabic Syrians are the majority in that area, and so it was kind of a silly plan from the very beginning. It was not mature. It was not thought out by wise people. And I think the Russians really have wisdom that is superior to that of the deep state actors who have concocted this strange scheme to set up a Kurdish state that is totally impractical. So I believe that the major sources of friction are beginning to diminish, but there still will be challenges.
Iran has also had Syria since the beginning of the crisis, and the Iranian Pasdaran have spared Russians huge human losses. Given the current situation, do you believe that Iran can now be an obstacle to peace or not?
I don't believe that they will. The Russians have taken the position that they do not have the power to order Iran to remove troops from Syria. clearly, if the Iranian part of the alliance were to depart, it would be the only people who would gain really would be the terrorists, and I don't think President Assad will agree with that. So the Russians proposed that perhaps there could be a limit to where Iranian troops would not come within 100 kilometers of Israeli-controlled territory. The Israelis refused to accept that, but I think as a practical matter, they're not going to be able to do anything about it. And so people will complain about Iran, but the fact is we have been fighting in the Middle East. The United States has been fighting for 17 years. We have not scored a single victory in a single country in 17 years. And we've been 7 years in Syria, and the Syrian government is defeating every terrorist group that we have sponsored. So the American people they're bored and they're tired with the wars in the Middle East. And so I don't think they're going to get fired up about whether Iran has a presence in Syria or does not. Now, over time, when peace returns, the Iranians are not going to want to keep a large military force in Syria because it's expensive. They can't afford to do it, and they would much rather have the Syrians take care of the Syrian problem. But the problem is we will not let the war end. We have these deep state actors who keep funneling money to the terrorists, giving them diplomatic support. We really need an absolutely clear declaration from President Trump that we're getting out of Syria, we're closing down the 11 military bases that we operate in Syria, we're withdrawing all of our troops, all of our contractors. We are not supplying any rebel group of any type with anything, not weapons, not food, nothing. We're going to stop, and then we're going to eliminate the sanctions. If we would eliminate the sanctions, refugees would begin pouring back into Syria. It would take a lot of pressure off of Europe. Now, the European governments, particularly Germany, France, Great Britain, they haven't made the connection that if we will just stop stirring up wars in the Middle East, we'll stop having a refugee crisis. We didn't have a refugee crisis out of North Africa until we conquered Libya and destroyed the government. Now it has no government. And so consequently, people are funneling from all over Africa, pouring into Europe, going on the welfare rolls, committing crimes that Europeans have never seen in their lifetimes. And so it's time for Europeans to begin to understand that these wars in the Middle East are destroying Europe. And they need to stop following the lead of this US-led coalition and say, hey, look, it's time that we start taking care of our own country, and we do it by saying we're finished. We're not providing troops. We're not doing anything that will continue these wars in the Middle East, because we are suffering. Italians are suffering. Now, in Italy, the government has come to its senses and said, this is insane. We're, we're letting other people take over and force Italians out of Italy. The same thing is happening in France. It's happening in Germany. They haven't awakened in France or Germany. They haven't awakened in the UK, but they've awakened in Hungary and Poland, in the Czech Republic, in Romania. And there's going to have to be just a revelation among the people that immigration must stop if we're going to maintain our nations. I don't think we need to have asylum. No country should be required or forced to accept people who are willing to simply lie and say, oh, if I go back, they'll kill me. Well, how do you know that? This is a liar's game. And the laws are designed to foster immigration by masses of people who are willing to lie. And I don't think that's the kind of people who form a good society. So it's time for the West to end the wars, starting with Syria, and end the immigration and stabilize the world. We need to stop feeling that somehow we have an obligation to go in and impose sanctions and then no-fly zones, and then we bomb the country into rubble and leave body parts lying out in the streets, and then we send in terrorists, and then we try to establish puppet governments. This is insane. And meanwhile, we have Russia, which is trying to bring peace in Syria, and I think they would bring peace in other places if they were involved. But meanwhile, we see China. China comes in, and they don't overthrow the government, but they build roads, they build schools, they build factories, and in the end, who is going to win? It's not going to be the West, it's going to be the Chinese, because if you are the leader of a nation, you'd rather have a country come in and build roads than come in and overthrow your government and kill everyone. We've gone through a period of insanity in the West, absolute insanity. And the leaders are totally incompetent. We have good people in the West. Western civilization still thrives, but it thrives in spite of the governments. And the governments, they need to change. And, fortunately, some of them are changing. And we need to have more of them, and I hope we see rapid change, because if we don't, I think Western civilization may very well perish as a result of these terrible decisions being made.
I have a question about President Trump, because many Americans hope that Trump's presidency would lead to a positive turn in relation with Russia. Is it now possible that Washington and Moscow finally agree well on Syria and other international issues?
I believe that President Trump wants to end the war in Syria. He has said so, but every time he says so, people, the Obama people who are left in the government, managed to stage a false flag gas attack, a pretend attack. The latest one in Ghouta never even occurred. And they put pressure on Trump because they've created this Russia hoax that somehow Russia was involved in changing our elections because they spent $100,000 on Facebook ads. And, we talk about, well, Russia did this. Well, Russia is a big country. if some person in the United States takes out a Facebook ad against a politician in Italy, Italy doesn't say, well, the United States is colluding to change our election. No, it's some fellow out of New York, some Italian guy who has he really believes in this person or in that person, and I think that's probably what has happened with Russia. I think there have been people, some of them are actually American citizens, and they take out ads in Russia, and then we blame it on the Russian government. Automatically, everybody in Russia who exercises their independent judgment and says, I like Hillary Clinton or I like Donald Trump, if they take out an ad on Facebook, all of a sudden that's attributed to President Putin. And President Putin, he doesn't have the time to take out ads on Facebook. So I do believe that President Trump has a strong desire to work with President Putin. I think the two men tend to like one another. And I really believe that people should talk to one another. You can talk with your worst enemy, and if you talk with him for a while, you'll find something that you agree on. And it's better to talk than it is to edge our nations closer to nuclear war. Russia presents no threat to Europe, no threat to the United States. They're no threat to anyone. They have plenty of land. They don't need to expand. Now, they've had some problems with the Ukraine, but they never had those problems until the Central Intelligence Agency and MI6 staged a coup, and they overthrew the government of Ukraine in Kiev. Russia had to react. They had to move into Crimea because their fleet was stationed there. But they did it without firing a bullet. Why? Because the Crimeans consider themselves Russians. They want to be part of Russia. And then with the Donbass, the people of the Donbass said, look, we're Ukrainians, but we don't follow a government that's formed out of a bunch of people who toppled the government and threw fire bombs and things and weren't elected by anybody. Those are not our leaders, and so they have taken a position that no, we're not giving in to a group of terrorists in Kiev. We're going to, function independently, and I think it's a natural thing to happen. And there's no risk. Russia doesn't threaten to invade Kiev and conquer countries to the west. There's a much greater threat of the West against Russia. We have troops right on the Russian border. Why? There's no sense in it. So it's the foreign policy. It's too bad that we don't have a board where we can just wipe it clean and say, let's start over. What makes sense? Well, one thing that makes sense is for the United States to work very closely with Russia. We have a great deal in common with Russia, and work to increase global prosperity, to bring about peace. We need to wall off the Middle East. We can trade with them, but we don't need to bring their culture into European culture. It's not helping. I just read the other day that in Great Britain, they have hundreds of acid attacks now. Now, they never had an acid attack ever until they began to bring in radicals out of the Middle East. And these people from places like Saudi Arabia. They believe that if you go up and you make a sexual advance to a woman and she says no, you throw acid in her face and you blind her and disfigure her for life. There are hundreds of these happening now in London. It's insane. Why do you bring people into your country who intend to throw acid in the faces of your people? What kind of government accepts this? Certainly not a government that represents the people. They may represent the moneyed interests, the great banks, the global oligarchs who control the world, but they certainly do not represent the people of those countries at all. So my hope and my prayer is that we will have a change in government and that the people will have a voice in these European countries. We need to get away from the European Union, in my opinion. I think there is simply a dictatorship. It's not that much different than what Adolf Hitler once intended for Europe. Orders come down from Brussels, and people are forced to accept those orders. Well, that's that's not any sort of freedom. That's not representing the people. They're trying to destroy the nations. They're not trying to assist them in any way. So I hope there's a great deal of change in Europe and of course in the United States as well.
Well, Senator, I have a last question for you. It takes a long time to prepare a war, but also to finish it. With the liberation of a symbolic city of Daraa almost complete, what do you think is missing at the end of the Syrian war?
You know, ever since the Russians came in to support Syria, ever since President Assad invited the Iranians to come in and he asked them, would you please help me? And, I need your additional forces and advice. Syria has had an unbroken string of victories. They have captured almost every major city and certainly controlled 90% of the population of Syria. Right now, I think we need a change in the mindset of the West, and we need leaders who will seize control of the bureaucracy, the deep state in each of these nations, and will force them to end their wars. The wars are killing us. They're destroying our nation. 1/3 of the entire national debt of the United States came about because of our wars in the Middle East. And we haven't achieved a single thing. We could have spent that $7 trillion on building roads and bridges and schools and factories, but instead we've simply bled it away. And now we're putting pressure on Europe to build more tanks, build more planes, more guns, so that we can have more wars. Well, the wars are bleeding us. They're killing us. And it makes no sense that we should spend this vast amount of money on armaments when we are not being threatened, certainly not by Russia. Certainly not by Russia. So it will take some time to unwind the wars, but I really believe that President Trump has the power to say, we're going to end this. And if he can overwhelm the deep state, it will unwind. It is unwinding right now. President Trump ordered an end to the top secret program, Timber Sycamore. This was a CIA program that supplied arms to Al Qaeda and to ISIS and all rebel groups. And it's, if we can resolve some issues with Turkey, which are very complex, and I think Russia is the best country to orchestrate that, and then just pull the Americans out of there, get all the Americans out, and once we're gone, it'll send a signal to the rest of the world: the war in Syria is over. Get everybody home. Get all of the terrorists home. Be finished with it. And then thousands of people, already 500,000 people, have returned to the city of Aleppo ever since the government took it over. And you remember the UN was out there, oh, if Syria takes over Aleppo, there'll be a mass slaughter. No, there never was a mass slaughter. They simply moved the terrorists in green buses and let them escape to another place. And then they started moving Syrians back home. The Syrian government has been very, very good. And actually the percentage of civilians killed in the Syrian war has been relatively low, and mainly because of the Syrian government's policies. They've sacrificed a lot of soldiers in order to prevent excessive death of Syrian civilians. But I think it will wind down. I think it is winding down now, and it's just a question of how quickly we can end the war. And I hope that we have leaders. I would love to see the leaders in Italy say, we are going to recognize the nation of Syria. We're going to reestablish our diplomatic relations with them. We are going to begin to trade with Syria. We're going to talk with the United States about ending these sanctions. Why do we need sanctions? Do we need more suffering among the Syrian people than we've already caused? Enough is enough. Stop the suffering. Stop the hardship. Start the rebuilding. I would love to see Italy take a lead in this, because I think they can do that. I've been impressed by some of the actions that they've taken under this new government. I think the government it's on the right track. It's doing good things, and I hope they continue.
Well, Senator, thank you very much for your time, for your kindness answering our question, and maybe we meet each other again in the future when Syria is in peace.
Well, I hope so, and I hope to return to Syria and to this time to congratulate President Assad and the First Lady. I met with them a couple of years ago, and they're delightful people. Unlike the way that they're described in the mainstream media, they're doing, I think, a very fine job, and I look forward to meeting with them again and telling them thank you for what you have done, because had it not been for you and for key Russian leaders, Western civilization would be in full retreat at this point. So I do look forward to visiting with you again, Constantino, and I've enjoyed being with you today.
Goodbye. Thank you again.
Okay, well, thank you.